All right. Welcome to effectively week 3 for our U.S. History 1 course. I want to go over some points from week 2 so that you have some working understanding of where we are. First off, the syllabus discussion and the discussion on American exceptionalism are both extra credit discussions. Actually, depending on how well y'all do holistically on the origin of American exceptionalism discussion, I might actually count it as one of your top, or let it be counted as one of the top 5 to give it a grade. But I'm definitely counting Indigenous America, and as you probably noticed for week 3, you have just one discussion because some of these were discussions designed just to make sure that you were participating in the class and so I could count you as attending. But I do want to go over the ideas because we're going to revisit American exceptionalism quite a lot. It's one of the big debates in the world, in the U.S. today, because it has to do, again, with that historiography idea. How do we tell the story of U.S. history? Do we tell it as being the city upon a hill, the great example of democracy to the world, or do we actually reflect what historically happened and how we're still trying to change a lot of that? So this is a big part of why it's important for you to understand what American exceptionalism is. It is this idea that we are better than everybody else. It builds into it a sort of nationalism that can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Nationalism is something we'll be talking about as we go through the course. For the purposes of our course, we actually start seeing more of the idea of a national identity created after the War of 1812. In the periods that we're in right now, the exceptionalism comes from the English, basically, and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French, who are coming over here and taking control of the Native Americans under the idea that they are better than them, and then also bringing in Africans to do work after the Native Americans die, and as they've been dying in great numbers since the Europeans first arrived, and will continue to do so over 200 years or so because of the disease. It's not a coincidence that we will be talking about the Enlightenment in the near future, and the fact that while these ideas of democracy, representative government, capitalism, all of these things that come out of the Enlightenment that we think of today as good, also have a dark side to them, and that dark side has to do with how one rationalizes or justifies slavery and the social hierarchy that develops in the Western Hemisphere. And that's part of where the second discussion for this week on Indigenous America comes from. So I want to hit the high points on this, and I want to bring up some other things in this as well. The Glandler video, debunking myths about the Americas before Columbus, based on Charles Mann's book 1491, which I love, and in fact had debated having you actually read parts of it for this course. I've used it in the past and it is great. But basically, Mann, and then Glandler interpreting him, is doing a form of historiography as well. They're basically going against the idea that this was a barren country when the Europeans arrived, that there were few people living here and it was open wilderness, and the Europeans came and they converted it to usable land and did great things with it, which again hints to American exceptionalism. This is a story that the Europeans started telling, particularly the British, during the colonial period in the 16 and 1700s. Mann, however, argues that that's not the case. And to be fair to Mann, Mann's not a historian. Mann is a scientist. He's actually, I think he works with the weather, so I think he was trained with, but he started doing research and articles, traveling around the Western Hemisphere to write these articles. It might have been on geology now that I think about it. And started learning a lot about indigenous cultures prior to the arrival of Columbus, and wondered why exactly it is that we don't know more about these things and why they aren't taught to us in history books. So Glandler basically picks some of the big examples he has from his book, talking about what Native American life was like. And from what we can tell and what we're finding now, it was very vibrant, very diverse, and the Americas were very well populated. The societies ranged everywhere from nomadic peoples to the more settled and developed societies of the mound builders in the U.S. Southeast, what we recognize as the U.S. Southeast today, the people of Cahokia, the Pueblo peoples, the groups that would later go on to become like the Navajo, and Comanche, and the Plains peoples. Many of them were from settled cultures as well. And that the big societies, of course, the big civilizations are the ones the Spanish encountered first. The Mayas, the Aztecs, the Incas, and those peoples. And those peoples have long histories here. If you take Civ 1, we go all the way back to what is now recognized as the first civilization so far that we found in the Western Hemisphere, which is the Carl Supe civilization that developed in Peru. And what we know now from it is that it was the foundational starter civilization, if you will, that created many of the ideas of the Native American societies that were here when Columbus arrived, thousands and thousands of years later, in much the same way that for those of us who are of Western European descent, we tend to think of Greece and Rome and Mesopotamia and Egypt as our starter civilizations. We've derived many of our ideas and our social constructs from those earlier civilizations. So there was a civilization here that existed at the same time that ancient Egypt did, that the Mesopotamian did, that the pyramids were being built in Egypt, actually. There were pyramids being built here. So this is all kind of, again, rewriting the way we tell the story of history. Among the big things, though, is that when Columbus does arrive, obviously there are very, very complex societies that are here. And that's a big part of what this section is giving you an example of. We look at the Aztecs, who are actually what is called a Triple Alliance. It was an organization of multiple different types of Native Americans, different groups of Native Americans. The Nahua people were at the top. The people that we think of as the Aztecs were at the top and had made basically agreements, compacts, worked with two other indigenous groups scattered throughout the Central America. And effectively what Cortez does when he encounters them is he manages to fracture that Triple Alliance because some of the groups were less pleased with the Aztecs being at the top. And so he basically fractures that alliance, which is how he, with his very small number of men, manages to conquer that civilization. That coupled with the fact that they were dying of disease. And this is something that I don't think can be used enough, can be used as an explanation enough. One of the biggest reasons why the Spanish, in their small numbers, were able to conquer these societies with millions of people, particularly the Aztecs and the Incas, was because disease that they brought spread ahead of their actual encounters with them. And those diseases were debilitating to these societies. They literally collapsed from the inside as well because of this. All right. So in these questions, what was life like for the Native Americans? It varied, but for the most part, most of them were settled peoples who, like Europeans, dedicated much of the time of their day to growing food, to working within their civilizations. They were stratified. They had the vast majority, as with the Europeans and as with almost everywhere else in the world at that time, were people who were farming and producing food to feed everybody. As with societies throughout the rest of the world, there was a percentage, not a large percentage, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the society, that was not actively involved in the everyday production of food. And these were the people who made up the government officials, the religious leaders, the merchants, the people who were doing other things, as it were. But again, as it was in Europe and China and everywhere else in the world, a small percentage, because it still took a great majority of the people to produce enough food to create enough surplus to feed everybody. All right, so these larger civilizations, again, Cahokia, the mound builders, Pueblo, Anasazi, my gosh, all the big groups you can name, Incas, Mayas, Aztecs, all of these guys had developed a complexity. They had official religions. They had official languages, even though there were variations of languages spoken throughout their various empires, because they conquered other peoples. Again, very much like everywhere else. Standard of living, some would argue, and I think Glandler approaches this, was higher than it was in Europe. Certainly the cities in the Western Hemisphere were cleaner. The people were healthier in many respects, other than partly because they hadn't had exposure to those diseases that will now decimate them. But overall, the quality of life for most Native Americans was very good. All right. So, and that's how it compares to people from other parts of the world. Why do we have so many different stories and historical interpretation of the ways in which Native Americans lived? Well, this goes back to part of what Glandler is saying, and also part of what you should have gotten from the discussion of American exceptionalism, because the winners write the history, and there are different interpretations of what that history is. Many of the accounts we have of Native Americans come from the European colonizers. And for them, they're going to have to justify how and what right they have to conquer these peoples and to take their land and to make them subservient. And it is these stories that are part of where we have the history of Native Americans. It's from these early colonists and later colonists who are writing this, who are defending themselves and their way of life. If you actually look at some of the first colonial discussions of Native Americans, you'll see some very different stories in there. And a lot of it really depend on who the colonist was, what their intention was. There's an argument, and it's a good one, that the U.S. Constitution in many ways was a byproduct of discussions about how Native Americans ruled themselves. That in the Native American societies, as the vernacular goes, they voted with their feet. If they were living in a community that they didn't agree with, they could move to somewhere else and find another group with whom they agreed. And this was not all that uncommon. So the numbers of interpretations we have come from different time periods as well. The first colonists, the early Spanish, versus later encounters, when the British start coming over and start encountering Native Americans. There are some very different stories depending on, again, why they were here, what reason they had for writing about these accounts, and what their goal was, their perspective and their bias. Where do we get these stories, and what were the motivations behind them? Again, I just answered some of that. And what does this tell us about how history is written and why? Well, again, quite often it is written by the winners. It is written by the people who take control. And again, going back to the discussion on bias and historiography, a large part of what we see when we talk about indigenous history is a shift here, because many Native Americans now are academics and they want to see their history from their perspective, or a history from their peoples. So we're getting a lot more of those now. Much of that is oral history, stories that have been passed down for generations, and the historical profession itself has had to learn how to adapt to that, because defining the bias in those is very different with oral stories. There's also the question of memory. When recounting the story, is it being remembered exactly as it was told? Does each generation change a little bit? What happens? So using oral histories is a lot like using primary sources, but it's also a little bit different because it's not quite as static. All right, so that gets the big ideas here. You should have had in your discussion references to Locke and Wright, obviously. Maybe some primary source examples also from the American Yelp Reader, which would give you some of those early colonial biases about indigenous peoples. You should have been using the Glandler video, and you should have been using your multimedia, whatever your multimedia was that you chose. So you'd have had at least 4 sources in there. 5 if you used more than one from the American Yelp Reader. And you should have used some really good examples of this, and again, all of your citation. Now, I'm going to, as a reminder, top posts are due for you guys on Thursdays. And I won't accept them from you guys on Sundays. So unless you have emailed me and gotten permission to post late, then that's not going to be a doable thing. It's 10% per day, up to 3 days, after which I reserve the right to refuse it or to delete it. So please make sure that you are getting those top posts in on time so people have time to respond to you, especially as we go further along and the questions start becoming different, where I give you 3 or 4 questions, you pick one to write for your top post, and then you address the other questions in the peer comments. It is not fair to everyone who has to respond to you if you are posting late and you've chosen a question that's not common, so they are not having an opportunity to respond to that question. So you definitely want to be sure that you're getting those top posts in on time, or at least getting permission to post late if you're going to be late. All right, so for week 3, our discussion is on first contacts, and this is pretty straightforward. It has to do with again the different ways in which the different European powers deal with Native Americans themselves, and so that gets us not to just the Spanish and Portuguese, but also the English, the French, and the Dutch. It also introduces with these ideas of transatlantic slavery, because this also is first contact. These are African Americans, or Africans, actually, as they come across the Atlantic, who are now also often dealing with Europeans they have not encountered before, as they are bought by different European factions, and also periodically engaging with Native Americans as well. So, all right, your sources this week, definitely the American Yelp and the American Yelp Reader, so you'll have some primary sources in there to work with as well. And Lepore's first chapter, and this is available to you at that link. It is a PDF. You should be able to use page numbers in your citations for those. All right, so I encourage you to get started on this. I hope you're all warm and safe, and if you have questions, email me.